My new station gave me an axe, a helmet, and a warning about the sacred ground we stand on. They don't fight fires here. They follow 7 handwritten protocols for battling blazes that bend time, consume sound, and wear the faces of the dead. The 8th rule was violently crossed out, with a simple note beside it, a man's name and the year he failed. They say you can't run from your ghosts. I figured I'd give it a shot anyway. I put 2,000 miles and the entire Rocky Mountain range between me and Portland, trading the constant, weeping rain for a sky so big and empty it could swallow a man's grief whole. I was an EMT there. I was good at it until the day I wasn't. Until the day a kid's broken body felt too much like my own daughter's, and the world fractured. My partner Sarah found her own way out a month later, a way that left me with nothing but the echoing silence of our apartment and the bitter taste of failure, so I ran. I ran to Montana, seeking a peace I wasn't sure I deserved, a quiet so profound it might finally drown out the whispers. I found rural Metro Fire Station 12 instead. The station is a squat, cinderblock affair, hunkered down in a valley the Blackfeet once called Iskaskini Pixie, the place where the fire spirits dance. They considered the ground sacred, but also dangerous. A place you didn't build on unless you were prepared to honor what was already there. We were a tight-knit crew, a collection of misfits and lifers bound by the shared understanding that out here, help isn't just a few minutes away, it's us or nothing. There was Chief Marlowe, a man whose family tree had deeper roots in this valley than the cottonwoods lining the river. His face was a roadmap of past blazes and hard winters, and he carried the station's legacy like a weight he was born to bear. There was Red Finnegan, a silent enigma of a man who polished the chrome on our engine with a devotion that bordered on religious. He never spoke of his past, and no one dared ask. And then there was Tommy Kicking Woman. Tommy was a full-blood Blackfeet, a man whose quiet presence seemed to calm the very air around him. He told me once that we weren't working on this land, we were guests, and it was wise to remember our manners. I was just beginning to understand what he meant. I was searching for peace, but what I found was a fire with cold, blue-white flames. The call came in just after dusk. Structure fire. Residential. No other details. The ride out was routine, the familiar jolt and sway of the engine, a strange comfort. But as we rounded the final turn, a collective silence fell over the cab. There was no pillar of black smoke staining the twilight sky, no angry orange glow painting the undersides of the clouds. The house stood perfectly silhouetted, looking for all the world like nothing was wrong. "Maybe a false alarm," I muttered, but Chief Marlowe just shook his head, his knuckles white on the dash. As we got closer, we saw it. The light inside wasn't right. It pulsed from the windows in waves of cobalt and stark white, a light that didn't feel like combustion. It felt like a fever in the air. We geared up, the hiss of my regulator loud in the unnatural quiet. There was no roar, no crackle of consuming wood, only a low, electrical hum that vibrated through the soles of my boots. "Masks on! Axe and Halligan!" "Jake, you're with me," Marlowe ordered, his voice tight. The front door was unlocked. We pushed it open and stepped not into a blaze, but into a nightmare. The air was cool, thick with the smell of ozone and old grief. The blue-white light emanated from the walls themselves, casting sharp, dancing shadows. In the dining room, a family of 4 was gathered around a table. A mother, a father, 2 young kids. My medic's brain screamed, smoke inhalation, burns, get them out. But my eyes told me a different story. They weren't dead. They weren't even injured. They were trapped. The father stood at the head of the table, a carving knife held over a roast that wasn't there. He'd bring the knife down, slice through empty air, and smile a vacant, horrible smile. The mother, a napkin in her hand, would fold it, place it beside a plate, then pick it up and fold it again. And again. The 2 children, a boy and a girl, were setting forks down on the table with jerky, robotic motions, their faces plastered with the same serene, empty grins. Clink, clink, clink. The sound was brittle, mechanical. "Mom, is the table ready?" the little girl asked, her voice a perfect looping recording. I reached for the mother, my training taking over. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" My gloved hand went to her shoulder, and she didn't even flinch. She just continued her endless task, her eyes looking through me. There was no pulse I could feel, no life in her skin, just a chilling, unnatural coolness. They were puppets in a play, written by a madman. This fire didn't burn you. It hollowed you out and made you a prisoner in the happiest moment of your life, twisting it into a living hell. Marlowe pulled me back. "Leave them. We can't help them." His words hit me harder than any heat. We contained the fire, which felt more like banishing a ghost, and when we returned to the station, the exhaustion was deeper than physical. It was a soul-deep weariness. Marlowe called me into his office. On his desk was an old, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with neat, hand-written script. "These are the protocols, Jake," he said, his voice low. 7 of them, for 7 different kinds of incidents." He tapped the book. "This wasn't your standard house fire. This was a Protocol 3, a memory eater." I scanned the pages, each one describing a horror that defied every rule of physics I'd ever learned. Then my eyes landed on the last page. There was a rule, number 8, but it had been violently crossed out with thick, angry strokes of black ink. The paper was torn beneath the fury of the pen. Beside it, a note was scrawled in a shaky, desperate hand. "Failed. See Memorial Wall, Henderson, 1988. My blood went cold. I looked up from the book to the wall behind Marlowe's desk, where a small, polished brass plaque hung. It was a memorial to fallen firefighters. I'd seen it every day, but I'd never truly looked at it. Now, one name seemed to burn itself into my mind: C. Henderson. "These aren't suggestions, are they?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Marlowe's eyes were heavy with the weight of generations. "No, son," he said. "They're a manual for survival, written in blood. And the most important thing to remember is that sometimes, even they aren't enough." I had come to Montana to escape ghosts. I'd just discovered I'd taken a job hunting them. For 2 weeks, the memory of that family played on a loop in my own head, a chilling echo of their endless pantomime. I'd wake up in the dark. The vacant smiles from the blue-white fire burned onto the back of my eyelids. I spent my downtime poring over the 7 protocols, trying to fit the impossible into the neat, orderly boxes my EMT brain was built on. A Protocol 3 memory eater felt academic on the page, a detached description of an aberration. But I had felt the cold in that room. I had seen the living death, and I couldn't shake the image of that 8th, annihilated rule and the name on the memorial wall. Henderson, 1988. A ghost who had paid the price for failure. The peace I came to Montana for felt further away than ever. I was trading one set of ghosts for a whole new roster. The next call came on a clear, cold night, the kind where the stars seem sharp enough to cut you. A structure fire on North Meridian Road, a lonely stretch of asphalt cutting through ranch land. The dispatch was crackly, but the address was clear. This time, there was smoke. Thick, greasy plumes of it billowed into the pristine night, blotting out the constellations. This felt grimly familiar. This felt like a fire I knew how to fight. We were first on the scene, pulling up to a 2-story farmhouse fully engulfed in flame. But as soon as I hopped from the engine, I knew something was wrong. The sound was off. A normal house fire has a voice. A deep, guttural roar punctuated by the sharp crack of breaking glass and the groan of collapsing timbers. This fire sang. It was faint at first, a high, melodic current weaving through the chaos. I thought it was the wind or the shriek of burning materials. But then it grew clearer, a chorus of children's voices rising from the heart of the inferno. Tommy and Red heard it too. They froze, sharing a look of grim understanding that I was not yet a part of. And then I recognized the tune. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. My breath hitched in my throat. It wasn't some generic nursery rhyme. It was a lullaby my older sister Maya used to sing to me when I was small, a song only the two of us knew, a silly, simple thing we'd made up about a bear cub hiding from the thunder. Hush now, little bear, the moon's in the sky. The thunder can't find you, so don't you cry. The voices were sweet, innocent, and utterly, profanely wrong, coming from a house being consumed by fire. Every syllable was a violation, a key turning in a lock deep inside my soul. It was a burglar inside my most private memories, holding them hostage. This wasn't a random phenomenon. It knew me. It had reached into my mind, pulled out a piece of my childhood, and was using it as a weapon. "Jake!" Marlowe's voice was a lifeline, pulling me from the hypnotic horror. "What is it?" "That song?" I stammered, pointing a shaking gloved hand at the blaze. "It's mine. It's from my childhood." The look on Marlowe's face was instantaneous. The seasoned fire chief vanished, replaced by a grim-faced soldier recognizing an enemy's tactic. He didn't question me. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his radio. "All units, Station 12 is retreating to a defensive perimeter. I want a half-mile cordon. Dispatch, I need you to call in Station 7. Tell them it's a Protocol 4, active and targeted." We pulled back, the sweet, haunting melody of my past chasing us down the long driveway. Station 7 arrived less than 20 minutes later, and they were nothing like us. Their engine wasn't bright red, but a flat, light-absorbing black. They moved with the quiet, unnerving efficiency of a bomb squad. Their gear wasn't standard issue. It was bulky, covered in strange, swirling symbols etched into the surfaces, and hummed with a low-frequency energy that made the fillings in my teeth ache. They didn't unroll hoses. They carried heavy, dark containers and long poles that looked more like ritual staves than firefighting tools. They weren't there to douse the flames. They were there to perform an exorcism. We could only watch as they formed a circle around the house and began their work. There was no water, only chanting in a language I didn't recognize, and a strange, pulsing light from their equipment that seemed to push the fire back on itself, consuming it from within. The singing from the house warped, the children's voices turning to discordant shrieks before being snuffed out into absolute silence. An hour later, it was over. The fire was gone. Inexplicably, the house was still standing, blackened and scorched but physically intact. A victory, I thought. I was wrong. Marlowe let us do a walkthrough. The heat was gone, replaced by a deep, penetrating cold. But it was the walls that held the true horror. They were covered in what Tommy called memory stains. They weren't scorch marks or soot. They were three-dimensional reliefs made of solidified gray ash capturing the inhabitants in their final moments. A man, his arms thrown up to shield his face. A woman, curled in a corner, her mouth open in a silent scream. My medic's instinct, that cursed, driving need to help, took over. I saw the shape of a young boy, no older than 10, huddled by a doorway. Without thinking, I reached out and my bare fingers brushed against the cold, gritty surface of his ash-frozen cheek. Pain. Blinding and absolute. It wasn't physical. It was a psychic detonation. I was him. I felt the skin on my arms bubble and peel. I tasted the superheated air searing my lungs, the acrid flavor of pure, animal panic. I heard the song, his mother singing to him from the other room as the flames took her, and I felt his small heart burst with a terror so complete it annihilated his soul. The agony of a life being shredded to its last fiber slammed through me in a single, paralyzing instant. I collapsed, gasping on the floor, the psychic scream still echoing in my skull. Red and Tommy hauled me to my feet and dragged me outside into the clean, cold air. I looked down at my hand, the one that had touched the stain, and it felt alien, contaminated. We had won. We had banished the fire, but the victory left a permanent, painful scar on the world, a cold bas-relief of suffering, a monument to a final, agonizing moment. And now, a piece of that agony was a scar inside me. The psychic shrapnel from the Meridian Road fire stayed lodged in my soul. I'd be checking equipment, and for a split second, I'd feel a phantom heat on my arms. I'd hear a child laugh in the street, and my gut would clench, waiting for the melody that followed. My world had developed a hairline crack, and I was terrified of what else might slip through. I didn't have to wait long. The call came during the worst blizzard of the year, a whiteout so complete it felt like the world had been erased. The wind howled like a starving animal, and snow was coming down not in flakes, but in blinding, horizontal sheets. Dispatch reported a visual, a column of fire, spotted by a brave soul on a snowplow out on Highway 89. Protocol 6. Marlowe announced over the roar of the engine, his voice grim. I flipped to the right page in the ledger I now kept in my gear locker. Protocol 6. Temporal anomaly. Unstable timeline. Standard suppression ineffective. Observe extreme caution. As we neared the coordinates, the impossibility of it hit us. Through the swirling chaos of the blizzard, a pillar of fire burned straight up into the sky. It wasn't bent by the gale-force winds or smothered by the snow. It was a perfect, unwavering torch punching a hole through the storm, a place where the laws of nature had been suspended. The flames didn't roar. They emitted a low, vibrato hum that seemed to make the very air tremble. "Perimeter!" Marlowe yelled as we disembarked into the icy fury. 200-yard minimum. Nobody gets close. We struggled to set up, the cold so sharp it felt like breathing crushed glass. The radio was a mess, a constant roar of atmospheric interference. Then, through the hiss and crackle, another sound emerged. A voice. It was faint, a whisper coiling through the static, frayed and thin like an old recording. "Back. Stay back the ice." I froze, convinced the blizzard was playing tricks on my ears. I keyed my mic. "Say again, dispatch. You're breaking up." The voice returned, clearer this time, cutting through the static for a precious second. "Doesn't stop it. It hides it. Stay back from the burn line." It wasn't dispatch. It was old, weary, and laced with an urgency that transcended the decades. Tommy looked at me, his eyes wide. He'd heard it too. "Chief," I said, my own voice tight. "We've got a voice on the line. It's not one of ours. He's warning us to hold the perimeter." Before Marlowe could answer, a name surfaced from the static, spoken with an eerie clarity. "This is Captain Walsh. Anyone read me? You're walking into a trap." A stunned silence fell over our comms. Captain Cillian Walsh. His name was on the memorial plaque at the station, right next to Henderson's. "Died in the line of duty, Blizzard Fire, 1979. We were getting guidance from a ghost." Marlowe, to his credit, didn't miss a beat. "You heard him! Hold this line! Do not advance!" As I relayed Walsh's ghostly instructions, warnings about pockets of unstable time near the fire's edge, the entity seemed to notice. It learned. The voice on the radio, Walsh's voice, suddenly became sharp and clear, losing its frayed, distant quality. It was too perfect. "Jake, they're coming around your left flank. I see them in the flame. You have to move. Get your crew closer to the base," the new, clean voice commanded. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a direct order, preying on my duty to protect my team. But at the exact same moment, the other voice, the true, static-laced ghost of Walsh, screamed through the interference. "No, it's a lie. Hold the line, boy. It's mimicking me. Don't listen." I was trapped, a war erupting inside my helmet. Two voices, both claiming to be my lifeline, gave me conflicting, life-or-death orders. One was a spirit trying to save us, the other a monster luring us into a temporal cage. The radio, our only connection in the blinding storm, had become a source of profound paranoia. Who could I trust when the ghost and the static had a demonic echo? "Jake, what are your orders?" Red yelled, his form a barely visible shape in the swirling snow. I couldn't answer. My mind was a battlefield. And then, the fire's temporal distortion began to leak. I blinked, and the world jumped. 1 second, I was standing beside the engine. The next, I was 20 feet to the right, with no memory of moving. I saw Tommy stumble, his head whipping around as if trying to find a moment he'd just lost. The distortion was contagious, rippling outward from the blaze. Then came the scream. It burst from the radio, a blast of pure, undiluted terror that overrode both of Walsh's voices. It was a chorus of agony, a sound we all knew intimately. It was us. It was the sound of our own crew, my own voice among them, screaming in final, horrifying pain. It wasn't a memory, it was a premonition, a broadcast from a few seconds in our own future. "Fall back!" Marlowe roared, his command finally cutting through my paralysis. As we scrambled away, a wave of shimmering, invisible force pulsed from the fire. It passed through the very spot where we would have been standing had I obeyed the mimic's voice. The air wavered, and for a terrifying instant, I saw it, our own spectral afterimages caught in a silent, screaming loop of agony before vanishing. The scream on the radio had been a warning, a horrifying, last-second echo of a fate we had only narrowly avoided. We didn't beat the fire, we just ran from it, leaving the ghost of Captain Walsh to his lonely vigil in the storm. The threat was no longer something we just observed. It was actively trying to pull us into its broken, repeating logic, and it had left a chilling prophecy in our ears, the sound of our own deaths, waiting for the one time we failed to outrun the echo. The echo of my own future scream became a permanent resident in my head. It was a constant low hum of dread beneath the surface of my thoughts, a reminder that survival in this job wasn't a guarantee, it was a reprieve. We were living on borrowed time, and the clock was always ticking. I found myself obsessing over the protocols, trying to map the madness, to find a pattern in the chaos. But the ledger wasn't a textbook, it was a bestiary, and we were woefully unprepared for the next creature to crawl out of the page. The alert came for the old Black Pine ski resort, a place that had been abandoned for 20 years, a skeleton of tourism left to the mercy of the harsh Montana seasons. From 10 miles out, we could see there was no smoke. Not a wisp. Just a strange, shimmering distortion in the air above the main lodge, like a pocket of intense heat haze on a freezing afternoon. It was another sign that this was not a fire for hoses and water. The road up was a crumbling ribbon of asphalt, and as we got closer, the world began to change. The first thing to go was the wind. The howling gale that had been rattling our windows just stopped. Then the crunch of the tires on the gravel faded, followed by the deep rumble of the engine itself. It was as if we'd driven into a thick blanket of felt that was absorbing every vibration, every sound. By the time we parked, the silence was absolute. It was a physical presence, a pressure against the eardrums that was more deafening than any noise. "Protocol 5, Marlowe said, but his voice was gone, swallowed the moment it left his lips. He held up 5 fingers, his face a grim mask in the eerie stillness. We geared up, the clicks and snaps of our buckles making no sound. The only thing I could hear was what was inside my own head, the frantic thump of my heart and the loud, ragged hiss of my own breathing through the regulator. The very equipment meant to keep me alive was now a source of roaring, claustrophobic noise in a dead, silent world. We moved toward the lodge, a team of ghosts walking through a soundless landscape. The fire was inside. Through the grimy plate glass windows, we saw it. It wasn't a raging inferno, but a column of placid white light burning in the center of the lobby. It consumed a grand stone fireplace, climbing the chimney with a serene, chilling grace, producing no smoke, no heat I could feel, and no sound at all. And in the silent flames there were figures. They were translucent, shimmering like the air above a hot road. The ghosts of the resort's old maintenance crew, trapped in the moment of their death during a boiler explosion years ago. They weren't looping through a memory, they were waiting, they were aware, and as we watched, they turned their hollow eyes towards us. That's when the whispers started. They weren't sound waves, they were thoughts, injected directly into my mind. It was a psychic lure, and it was horrifyingly personal. It bypassed my ears and went straight for my soul. For Red, whose life was a bastion of order and control, the whisper was one of brokenness. It's all wrong. You can fix this. You have the tools. We need you to make it right. For Marlowe, the legacy chief, it was an appeal to his authority. We're lost, Chief. We don't know the way out. You have to lead us. It's your duty. But for me, it was a scalpel, honed and precise, aimed directly at the wound I'd fled Portland to escape. The whisper that flooded my mind was a chorus of desperate spectral voices, a symphony of need. Hurt. We're so hurt. Trapped in here. We need a medic. Please. There are people injured. A medic. My training, the core of my identity for a decade, screamed at me to move. Every fiber of my being strained to push forward, to break the perimeter, to get to the injured. My hands twitched, my medic's brain already triaging ghosts, running through procedures for injuries I couldn't see on bodies that didn't exist. It was the purest, most agonizing temptation I had ever known. The fire wasn't just burning wood, it was trying to consume my very purpose and use it as fuel. I dug the heels of my boots into the ground, fighting a war against myself. I saw Red take a half step forward before shaking his head violently, his own breathing a frantic rasp in my ears. This was the silent hunger. It didn't just want the building. It wanted us. It wanted to add us to its collection. Then Tommy Kicking Woman moved. He stepped past Marlowe, his face calm, showing no signs of the psychic assault. He walked to the edge of the silent zone, stopping just before the invisible line where sound died. He didn't try to shout. He didn't carry a tool. He simply stood, a beacon of calm in the oppressive quiet. He raised his hands, palms open, in a gesture of peace. He couldn't speak to them, so he showed them. He pointed to the faded resort logo on the wall, then made a gesture of closing a book. He pointed at the ghostly figures, then swept his arm towards the distant snow-capped mountains, a gesture of release. He looked at each of them, his gaze filled not with fear, but with a profound, compassionate sorrow. His message was clear, sent on a current of pure intent. Your work is done. Your shift is over. You can go home now. For a long moment, the silent figures stared. The psychic pleading in my head intensified into a desperate crescendo, then faltered. One by one, the shimmering forms looked at Tommy, then at the silent burning light, and then they began to fade, dissolving like smoke in a wind I couldn't hear. As the last spirit vanished, the fire went out. It didn't die down. It just ceased to exist. And in an instant, the sound of the world came rushing back in a deafening wave. The wind, the groaning of the old building, the frantic pounding of my own heart. The silence had been a predator. Its absence was a relief so profound it brought me to my knees. I knelt there, gasping in the sudden noise, shaken to my core. I had faced fire that burned memories and twisted time, but this was worse. This fire had shown me that the best part of me, the medic who ran toward the hurt, was a vulnerability. It was a hook. And the ancient things that slept in these mountains knew exactly how to bait it. We didn't get a call, we got a summons. Every pager, every radio, every single alert system at Station 12 shrieked to life at once, with a piercing, unified tone I'd never heard before. On the central display where calls were listed, there was only a single blinking block of red text, full protocol alert. Ravens Hollow. A cold dread, heavier than any physical exhaustion, settled over the firehouse. A full alert meant the entity wasn't just a Protocol 3 or 6. It meant it was all of them and more. It was something that had crawled off the edge of the map. Ravens Hollow was a brand new housing development, a collection of cookie-cutter homes carved into a hillside the Blackfeet had avoided for centuries. They said it was a place of burial, a ground so soaked in the memory of a violent, forgotten history that you didn't dare disturb the soil. The developers had called it progress. Tommy Kicking Woman had called it sacrilege. It turned out he was right. From miles away, we saw that it wasn't a fire. It was a sickness. The development was centered around a large two-story showcase home, and this house was alive. 2 large bay windows on the second floor glowed with a sickening, jaundiced light. They weren't reflecting a blaze within. They were the blaze. And they were weeping. A thick, viscous, luminescent ichor, like molten sorrow, oozed from the frames and slid down the siding, which seemed to sag and warp like living flesh. "God," Red whispered from the seat next to me, his voice hollow, "the house has eyes." And the smoke. It wasn't smoke. From the roof of the central house, great, writhing tendrils of something dark and organic pulsed into the sky. They looked like umbilical cords made of shadow and pain, and as they lashed out, they connected to the surrounding houses. Where they touched, the lights in the other homes flickered and died. The perfectly manicured lawns browned and withered in seconds. It was siphoning the life from the entire neighborhood to feed itself. As one of the tendrils writhed closer to our position, I saw what it was made of. Faces. Hundreds of them. Pulpy and indistinct, were boiling within the shadowy appendage, their mouths open in silent, molten screams. It was a sentient, biological structure of pure suffering. We didn't even try to get close. We formed a cordon a half-mile away, a pathetic line of defense against a god. This was beyond us. This was a force of nature, an ancient, non-human thing that had been woken from its long slumber by the bite of bulldozers. As chaos reigned, Tommy Kicking Woman was an island of impossible calm. He walked to the back of our engine, opened a long, narrow case I had never seen before, and drew out an arrow. It wasn't for a modern bow. The shaft was dark, polished wood, fletched with the black feathers of a raven. The arrowhead wasn't stone or flint, but a sliver of what looked like obsidian, so dark it seemed to drink the light around it. It felt ancient, humming with a quiet power that was a perfect counterbalance to the chaotic energy of the creature on the hill. "Tommy, what are you doing?" Marlowe asked, his voice strained. "What my grandfather's grandfather was meant to do, if this day ever came," Tommy replied. His voice was serene. He wasn't a firefighter anymore. He was a warrior stepping into a role that had been waiting for him his entire life. He slung a simple, powerful bow over his shoulder and began to walk toward the monstrosity. "Tommy, no," I shouted, starting after him. Marlowe threw an arm out, stopping me. His grip was like iron. "You can't go, Jake. This is his fight, his alone." We watched, helpless, as Tommy walked steadily across the dying landscape. The creature seemed to sense him, one of its massive tendrils peeling away from a house and slithering toward him. It rose up like a great serpent, the screaming faces within it writhing. Tommy didn't break his stride. He stopped, knocked the ancient arrow, and drew the bowstring. In that moment, he was the calmest thing in the entire valley. He loosed the arrow. It didn't fly, it streaked. A thin line of blackness cutting through the sickly yellow light. It struck the central house, right between the 2 weeping eyes. There was no sound, no explosion of fire and debris. There was a detonation of pure, psychic force. A silent bomb of white light erupted behind my eyes, and a wave of pressure slammed into us, throwing me from my feet. A billion silent screams washed through my mind, the ancient agony of the entity itself as it was unmade. When I could see again, it was over. The house was just a house again, dark and still. The tendrils were gone. The weeping eyes were just dark windows. The sky was clear. But the price. The terrible, terrible price. Tommy was still standing where he had fired the arrow, his bow hanging limply in his hand. He was perfectly still, like a statue. We rushed to him, and as I got close, I saw his face. It was a mask of placid emptiness. But his eyes were a war. They were wide, staring at nothing we could see, and in their depths, I saw a frantic, silent battle being waged. The psychic feedback, the death rattle of that ancient thing, had nowhere to go. The arrow had destroyed its body, but its consciousness, its ancient evil, had latched on to the only available vessel. It had latched on to Tommy. He had saved the valley. He had saved us all. But in doing so, he had become the living prison for an unspeakable horror, locked in a permanent, silent battle for his own soul. He was there, but he was gone. The ride back from Raven's Hollow was a silent, somber procession. Tommy sat in the cab between me and Marlowe, his body present but his mind. His mind was a battlefield 1,000 miles away. He stared straight ahead, his hands resting calmly in his lap. But his eyes were a storm. They darted back and forth, tracking horrors only he could see, his pupils dilating and contracting with the rhythm of some invisible, eternal struggle. We had brought his body back, but we had left his soul on that hill, shackled to the ghost of the thing he had killed. We didn't go back to the station. We couldn't. The sight of the empty coffee cup he'd left on the table, the jacket slung over his chair, it was all too much. Marlowe drove us instead to a place I'd never been. A low-slung, windowless bar on the outskirts of town called The Embers. It wasn't a place you went for a good time. It was a place you went to bleed out the poison. The man behind the bar was built like a retired heavyweight, with deep-set, knowing eyes and hands that looked strong enough to crush rock. He wore a simple white apron over a dark shirt. He took one look at our faces, at the hollowed-out expression on Red, at the crushing weight on Marlowe's shoulders, and at the vacant, warring stillness of Tommy, and simply nodded. "Frank," Marlowe said, his voice thick with grief. "It happened." Frank didn't need details. He poured 4 glasses of whiskey, his movements slow and deliberate. He set one in front of me, Red, and Marlowe. The 4th he placed on the bar near Tommy's unmoving hand. It was a gesture of respect for the man who was no longer there. "He saved the whole valley," Marlowe rasped, downing his drink in one fiery swallow. "He saved us all." "The price is always high," Frank said, his voice a low rumble. He wiped down a clean section of the bar, his expression one of profound, weary empathy. He wasn't just a bartender. He was a confessor, a witness. We were on neutral ground here, a sanctuary for the haunted. Frank looked at me, his gaze lingering. "The chief tells me you have the sight, son, that you see things." I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. "Then you should see the rest," Frank said. He disappeared into a back room and returned not with another bottle, but with a massive, ancient book. It was even older and more worn than Marlowe's protocol ledger. It was bound in dark, cracked leather, its corners worn smooth by generations of hands. He laid it open on the bar with the reverence of a priest handling a sacred text. "This is the Zimmerman ledger," he said softly. "Been kept by my family for 200 years. It started with an old trapper who saw what really lived in these mountains and decided someone ought to keep track." The pages were thick, yellowed parchment, filled with spidery script from dozens of different hands. On the left side of each page was a description of an entity, a name, a location, a protocol number if one existed. I saw familiar entries: Memory Eater, North Meridian Road. Next to it a note read Contained. I saw Temporal Anomaly, Highway 89, active. But it was the right side of the page that made the air leave my lungs. Next to every entry, every monster, every contained horror, was a list of names. "What is this?" I asked, my voice a croak. "The cost," Frank said, his voice heavy. "This isn't a book of monsters, kid. It's a book of accounts. That's the true cost of containment. For every one of those things we lock away, a price has to be paid. A life, a soul, a mind. We don't win these fights. We just pay the toll to keep the road open for everyone else." My eyes scanned the names, a history of sacrifice written in faded ink. I saw C. Henderson, 1988, next to a horrifying description of the creature from the failed 8th Protocol. I saw C. Walsh, 1979, listed against the blizzard fire. They weren't just heroes who died in the line of duty. They were payments. They were the blood price. Frank picked up a quill pen from behind the bar, dipped it in an inkwell, and his hand was perfectly steady as he turned to the last page. Under the entry for Raven's Hollow Ancient, in the column marked Containment, he wrote a new name, Thomas, kicking woman. The finality of it was a physical blow. Seeing his name inscribed in that book of the dead, our friend, our brother, officially tallied as the cost of victory. We weren't firefighters. We were the latest participants in a long, brutal, secret history of necessary, bloody sacrifice. Frank then unrolled a large, detailed map of the county and laid it over the ledger. It was dotted with dozens of colored pins, 47 of them. "Those aren't dormant threats," Marlowe said, his voice ragged, following my gaze. "They're ticking clocks." And in that dim, quiet bar, the full weight of my new reality crashed down on me. I finally understood. The pins on that map weren't just monsters in waiting. They were graves. They were 47 future sacrifices waiting to happen. This job wasn't about winning. It wasn't about saving the day. It was about standing on a line that could never be erased and deciding who would be the next to pay an eternal, terrible price. The Zimmerman ledger changed everything. The world was no longer just a place of quiet mountains and big skies. It was a cage, and I could now see the bars. The 47 pins on Frank's map haunted my sleep. Each one was a debt waiting to be collected. Tommy's empty chair at the station was a constant, silent accusation. We were adrift. A crew shattered by a victory that felt like the worst kind of defeat. We were still responding to mundane calls, kitchen fires, highway accidents, but it all felt like a pantomime. We were treating scrapes while the patient was bleeding out from a mortal wound none of us knew how to close. Then the tremors started. They weren't earthquakes, not in any geological sense. They were deep, resonant pulses that seemed to come from the bedrock of the planet itself. The water in our glasses would tremble. A low, subaudible hum would fill the air for minutes at a time, a vibration so profound it felt like the world was clearing its throat. The animals knew. The birds fell silent. The deer vanished from the meadows. They understood a predator was stirring, one so large it defied comprehension. Marlowe got a call directly from Frank. There was no protocol for this. There was no entry in the ledger. The pin on the map wasn't a small dot. It was a massive, shaded region covering most of Glacier National Park. The tremors were centered deep beneath the ice fields. "It's waking up," Marlowe said, his face pale, his voice stripped of all authority. He looked like a man staring at a tidal wave. "Frank's people say it's from the last ice age. It's not in the mountain, it is the mountain." There was no plan. There were no tools, no rituals. No ancient arrows that could stop something on a geological scale. We were microbes facing a continent. All we had was me. My sight. The crack in my mind that let the whispers in was our only pathetic, desperate long shot. The idea was simple and insane. I would try to make contact. To talk to it. To ask it to please, go back to sleep. Frank and Marlowe drove me as far as the park road was open. We stood at the edge of Logan Pass, the air thin and painfully cold. The majestic peaks surrounding us no longer looked like stone and ice. They felt like the bones of a slumbering titan. The hum was stronger here, a vibration that resonated deep in my chest. This was it. This was the big one. I didn't know how to begin. How do you talk to a god? I just closed my eyes, shut out the freezing wind, and reached out with my mind, not with words, but with a feeling, a fragile plea for connection. What came back was not a whisper, it was not a voice, it was annihilation. The instant I made contact, my consciousness was ripped from my body and flung into an abyss of time and pressure. My sanity was a grain of sand scoured by a billion-year-old glacier. I was an insignificant microbe trying to speak to a mountain, and the mountain had noticed. Its consciousness was not angry, it was not malevolent, it was vast, patient, and utterly terrifyingly alien. It showed me things. Not in images, but in pure, direct comprehension. I felt the weight of the ice, a mile thick, grinding continents into dust. I experienced the crushing, patient cold of a world locked in frost for millennia. I felt the slow, ponderous thoughts of a being that measured its life in the turning of ice ages, a consciousness for whom all of human history was less than a single fleeting breath. The psychic assault was brutal. It wasn't an attack. It was simply the consequence of my tiny, fragile mind touching its infinite one. My memories were shredded, my sense of self dissolving into the overwhelming pressure of its existence. The faces of my daughter, my partner Sarah, Marlo, Red. They were like photographs dropped into a furnace, curling and blackening at the edges. I was being unmade. And then, just as my sanity was about to shatter completely, it communicated. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a lesson. It agreed to return to its slumber, but first it wanted me to understand why. It pulled me forward, through the abyss of time, to a vision of the far distant future. I saw the Earth from space, but it was not the familiar blue marble. It was a white orb, frozen and dead. The sun was a shrunken, crimson ember in the sky. The ice had returned, locking the world in its final, silent embrace. The great cities of man were gone, ground to dust beneath glaciers that had reclaimed the planet. There was no life. There was no warmth. There was only the endless, patient cold. Its final message wasn't spoken in words, but seared into the deepest part of what was left of my soul, a truth so absolute it was chilling. Your time is a breath. My time is the tide. I will wait. And then it was gone. The pressure vanished. I was back on Logan Pass, collapsing into the snow, screaming. The psychic backlash was a firestorm in my skull. I had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had shown me the calendar on its wall. Our victory wasn't a victory. It was a temporary stay of execution, granted not out of mercy, but out of the calm, certain knowledge that our entire species, existence, was just a brief, warm anomaly. We were a fleeting fever on a planet whose natural state was ice. The entity wasn't defeated. It had simply hit the snooze button. It had all the time in the world. We didn't. The conversation with a god left me broken. The psychic firestorm that had ripped through my mind eventually subsided, but it burned away the filters that once separated my world from theirs. The change was permanent. I had stared into the heart of the abyss, and it had stared back, leaving a piece of its terrible, vast perspective lodged behind my eyes. My enhanced perception was no longer a flicker or a whisper. It was a constant, undeniable layer of reality. I was a man caught between two worlds, and I could no longer claim full citizenship in ours. When I walked down the street, I saw the faint, shimmering memory stains on the walls of old buildings, the ghostly imprints of laughter, arguments, and quiet desperation. I heard the low, constant static of the restless dead, a background hum to the sounds of the living. Driving past the mountains, I no longer saw majestic peaks of stone and snow. I saw the massive, sleeping shadows of the ancient things, their slow, tidal breaths causing the very air to tremble. I was irrevocably changed, scarred with a knowledge that brought no comfort, only a profound and unending sense of dread. The crew saw it. Marlo looked at me with a weary, sorrowful pity. Red, in his own quiet way, gave me a wider berth, as if I was radiating a coldness he could feel but not see. And Tommy and I shared a new, unspoken bond. He was a prison, his body a cage for a furious, ancient consciousness. I was a window, cursed to look out upon a landscape of horrors I could not ignore. We were two sides of the same terrible coin, two men who had paid a price that left us isolated from the very world we were trying to protect. One crisp autumn morning, a new recruit walked into the station. Her name was Alex Crow Feather. She was young, maybe 22, with the same quiet confidence I'd once seen in Tommy. She had dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Marlo introduced her around, and when she got to me, she didn't flinch. She didn't look away from the haunted, hollowed-out quality in my gaze. She looked at me, then over at Tommy, who was sitting at the kitchen table, meticulously cleaning a set of tools with a placid expression that didn't reach his warring eyes. She looked at us both, the broken and the caged, not with fear or even with pity, but with a grim stoic understanding. There was a flicker of recognition in her expression, a deep and sorrowful acceptance. She came from a tradition that already knew. She knew the stories, the real ones, the ones that weren't in the history books. She knew what slept in the mountains and what the ground remembered. She knew the price. And the most terrifying thing was, she looked ready to pay it. Her arrival underscored the brutal cyclical nature of our duty. We weren't a line of defense. We were a series of sacrifices. When one of us fell, or broke, or was hollowed out, another would have to step up to take their place. The battle was eternal, the cost absolute. Later that day, I stood alone, looking out the bay doors of the station as the sun began to set, painting the jagged peaks in hues of orange and deep purple. For months, I had been running. I had fled Portland to escape my ghosts, only to find monsters. I had sought peace, only to find a war that had been raging since the dawn of time. I had wanted silence, and instead I had been given the ability to hear the screams of the world. There was no going back. There was no escape. The man I was, the Portland EMT who believed a problem could be solved with gauze and pressure, was gone. The man who was left was something new. Something else. Alex Crowfeather walked up and stood beside me, following my gaze to the mountains. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" she said, her voice quiet but firm. I looked at the colossal, sleeping shapes I could now perceive, the slow, patient power that lay dormant beneath the beauty. I felt the low hum of their slumber, a promise of a future reckoning. I had found my purpose here in Montana, but it wasn't one of peace. It was a lifetime of vigilance. It was the duty of a sentinel standing watch on a fragile wall, forever listening. "Yeah," I said, my voice hoarse. "Beautiful." I was no longer just a firefighter. I was a guardian. My post was the thin, trembling membrane between humanity and the ancient horrors that lie sleeping. My peace would not be found in silence, but in listening for the first whispers of a world that was always waiting to reclaim its own.